Hello everyone, and welcome again to my garden and the second part of Charlotte's Web. You may remember that we left the story yesterday at the point where Fern was sitting on a milking stool watching her baby piglet, Wilbur, who's a bit less of a piglet now. We had just read she found an old milking stool that had been discarded and placed it in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly in the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. The sheep soon got to know her and trust her. So did the geese who lived with the sheep. All the animals trusted her. She was so quiet and friendly. Mr. Zuckerman, remember, he's the man who now owns Wilbur. Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and he didn't allow her to get into the pig pen, but he told Fern that she could sit on the stool and watch Wilbur as long as she wanted to. It made her happy just to be near the pig, and it made Wilbur happy to know that she was sitting there, right outside his pen. But he never had any fun. No walks, no rides, no swims. One afternoon in June, when Wilbur was almost 2 months old, he wandered out of his small yard outside the barn. Fern had not arrived for her usual visit. Wilbur stood in the sun, feeling lonely and bored. "There's never anything to do round here," he thought. He walked slowly to his food trough and sniffed to see if anything was overlooked from lunch. He found a small strip of potato skin and ate it. His back itched, so he leaned against a fence and itched it, rubbing his back against the boards. When he got tired of this, he walked indoors, climbed on top of the manure pile and sat down. He didn't feel like going to sleep. He didn't feel like digging. He was tired of standing still and tired of lying down. "I'm less than 2 months old and I'm tired of living," he said. He walked out into the yard again. "When I'm out here," he said, "there's no place to go but in, and when I'm indoors there's no place to go but out in the yard." "That's where you're wrong, my friend," a voice said. Wilbur looked through the fence and saw a goose standing there. "You don't have to stay in that dirty little yard," said the goose, who talked quite fast. "One of the boards is loose. Push on it, push on it and come out." "What?" said Wilbur. "Say that again." At the risk of repeating myself," said the goose, "I suggest you come on out. It's wonderful out here." "Did you say a board was loose?" That I did," said the goose. Wilbur walked up to the fence and saw that the goose was right. One board was loose. He put his head down, shut his eyes, and pushed. The board gave way. In a minute he had squeezed through the fence and was standing in the long grass outside his yard. The goose chuckled. "How does it feel to be free?" she asked. "I like it," said Wilbur. "That is, I guess I like it." Actually, Wilbur felt queer to be outside his fence, with nothing between him and the big world. "Where do you think I'd better go?" Anywhere you like," said the goose. "Go down through the orchard, root up the sod. Go down through the garden, dig up the radishes, root up everything. Eat grass, look for corn, look for oats, run all over, skip and dance, jump and prance, go down through the orchard and stroll in the woods. The world is a wonderful place when you're young." "I can see that," replied Wilbur. He gave a jump in the air, twirled, ran around a few steps, stopped. He looked around, sniffed the smells of the afternoon, and then set off walking down through the orchard. Pausing in the shade of an apple tree, he put his strong snout into the ground and began pushing, digging, and rooting around. He felt very happy. He had ploughed up quite a piece of ground before anyone noticed him. Mrs. Zuckerman was the first to see him. She saw him from the kitchen window and immediately shouted for the men. "Homer!" she cried. "Pigs out!" "Lurvy! Pig's out! Homer, Lurvy! Pig's out! He's down under that apple tree." "Now the trouble starts," thought Wilbur. "Now I'll catch it." The goose heard the racket, and she too started hollering. "Run, run, run downhill! Make for the woods, make for the woods!" she shouted to Wilbur. "They'll never, never, never catch you in the woods." The cocker spaniel heard the commotion and ran out from the barn to join in the chase. Mr. Zuckerman heard, and he came out of the machine shed where he had been mending a tool. Lurvy, now he's the hired man, someone who works on the farm. He heard the noise and came up from the asparagus patch where he had been pulling weeds. Everybody walked towards Wilbur, and Wilbur did not know what to do. The woods seemed a long way off, and anyway, he'd never been down there in the woods, and he wasn't sure he would like it. "Get round behind him, Lurvy," said Mr. Zuckerman, "and drive him towards the barn. Take it easy, don't rush him. I'll get a bucket of slops." Now, if you don't know, slops, that means a bucket of old vegetable peelings and bits of food that people don't want to eat anymore. It's what pigs really enjoy to eat. The news of Wilbur's escape spread rapidly among the animals on the place. Whenever any creature broke loose on Zuckerman's farm, the event was of great interest to the others. The goose shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. Then one of the cows told a sheep, and soon all the sheep knew. The lambs learned about it from their mothers. The horses in their stalls in the barn pricked up their ears when they heard the goose hollering, and soon the horses had caught on to what was happening. "Wilbur's out," they said, and every animal stirred its head and became excited to know that one of its friends had got free and was no longer penned up or tied fast. In that sentence, fast just means tied tightly together. It doesn't mean fast, like going at speed. Wilbur didn't know what to do or which way to run. It seemed as though everybody was after him. "Gosh, if this is what it's like to be free," he thought, "I think I'd rather be penned up in my own yard." The cocker spaniel was sneaking up on him from one side. Lurvy, the hired man, was sneaking up on him from the other side. Mrs. Zuckerman stood ready to head him off if he started for the garden, and now Mr. Zuckerman was coming down towards him carrying a pail. A pail, you know that word? It's another word for a bucket. "This is really awful," thought Wilbur. "Why doesn't Fern come?" And he began to cry. Now the goose took command and began to give orders. "Don't just stand there, Wilbur. Dodge about," cried the goose. "Skip around, run towards me, slip in and out, make for the woods, twist and turn." The cocker spaniel sprang for Wilbur's hind leg, his back leg. Wilbur jumped and ran. Lurvy reached out and grabbed. Mrs. Zuckerman screamed at Lurvy. The goose cheered for Wilbur. Wilbur dodged between Lurvy's legs. Lurvy missed Wilbur and grabbed the spaniel instead. Nicely done, cried the goose. "Try it again. Run downhill," suggested the cows. "Run towards me," yelled the gander. "Run uphill," cried the sheep. Think about what a gander is. Now, a gander is not a word that we use very often or come across often in books, but it's a type of animal, and I'm going to set you a challenge to find out, if you don't already know, which of the animals I've already mentioned can also be called a gander. Oh, here we have Mr. and Mrs. Zuckerman wildly chasing Wilbur the pig. You see, they don't really want him roaming free, because what pigs love to do is to root up the grass and the earth, and that's going to spoil their garden. "Twist and turn," honked the goose. "Jump and dance," said the rooster. "Look out for Lurvy," called the cows. "Look out for Zuckerman too," called the gander. "Watch out for the dog," cried the sheep. Listen to me," screamed the goose. Poor Wilbur was dazed and frightened by this hullabaloo. What a lovely word. That was one of our Year 3 spellings one week. Hullabaloo means a lot of fuss and noise. He didn't like being the centre of all this fuss. He did try to follow the instructions his friends were giving him, but he couldn't run uphill and downhill at the same time. And he couldn't turn and twist when he was jumping and dancing. And he was crying so hard he could hardly see anything that was happening. After all, Wilbur was a very young pig. Not much more than a baby, really. He wished Fern were here to take him up in her arms and comfort him. When he looked up and saw Mr. Zuckerman standing quite close to him, holding a pail of warm slops, he actually felt quite relieved. He lifted his nose and he sniffed. The smell was delicious. Well, delicious to him. Warm milk, potato skins, wheat middlings, that just means wheat bits of corn, toasted cornflakes, and a popover left over from the Zuckerman's breakfast. "Come, pig," said Mr. Zuckerman, tapping the pail. "Come, pig." Wilbur took a step towards the pail. "No, no, no," said the goose. "It's the old pail trick, Wilbur. Don't fall for it, don't fall for it. He's trying to lure you back into captivity. He's appealing to your stomach." And we have a drawing here of the scene as they are all running around trying to catch Wilbur. Now Wilbur did not care that this may be a trick. The food smelled appetising. He took another step towards the pail. "Pig, pig," said Mr. Zuckerman in a kind voice, and he began walking slowly towards the barnyard, looking around him innocently, as if he didn't know that a little white pig was following along behind him. "Sneaky move, Mr. Zuckerman." "You're going to be sorry, said the goose. But Wilbur didn't care, and kept walking towards the pail of slops. "You'll miss your freedom," honked the goose. "An hour of freedom is worth a barrel of slops." But Wilbur didn't care. When Mr. Zuckerman reached the pig pen, he climbed over the fence, poured the slops into the trough, and then pulled the loose board away from the fence, so that there was now a wide hole for Wilbur to walk in and out of. "Reconsider, reconsider," cried that goose. And Wilbur paid no attention. He stepped through the fence into his yard. He walked to the trough and took a long drink of slops, sucking in the milk hungrily and chewing the popover. It felt good to be home. While Wilbur ate, Lurvy fetched a hammer and some 8-penny nails. He nailed the board back in place. Then he and Mr. Zuckerman leaned lazily on the fence, and Mr. Zuckerman scratched Wilbur's back with a stick. "He's quite a pig," said Lurvy. "Yes, he'll make a good pig," said Mr. Zuckerman. Wilbur heard the words of praise. He felt the warm milk inside his stomach. He felt the pleasant rubbing of the stick along his itchy back. He felt peaceful and happy and sleepy. This had been a tiring afternoon. It was still only 4 o'clock, but Wilbur was ready for his bed. "I'm really too young to go out in the world alone," he thought, as he lay down. So that's why the chapter was called Escape. But he didn't escape for long, did he? Chapter 4 next. It's called Loneliness. The next day was rainy and dark. Rain fell on the roof of the barn and dripped steadily from the eaves. The eaves are those bits, the pointy bits on a pointed barn, the bottom of the roof. Rain fell in the barnyard and ran in crooked courses down the lane where the thistles and pigweed grew. Rain splattered against Mrs. Zuckerman's kitchen window, and it came gushing down the downspouts. We'd call those drains. Rain fell on the backs of the sheep as they grazed in the meadow. When the sheep tired of standing in the rain, they walked slowly up the lane and into the fold. That's the name of their sort of sheep pen. Rain upset Wilbur's plans. Wilbur had planned to go out this day and dig himself a new hole in his yard. he had other plans too. His plans for the day went something like this. Breakfast at 6:30. He'd have some skim milk, crusts, middlings, bits of doughnuts, wheat cakes with drops of maple syrup sticking to them, potato skins, leftover custard pudding with raisins, and bits of shredded wheat. Now, middlings is an unfamiliar word, and one that I don't know, but thinking about the rest of that sentence, I can guess it must be an American food that was eaten at the time of this story and was left over and put in a pail. His breakfast was going to be finished at 7. From 7 to 8, Wilbur planned to have a talk with Templeton, the rat that lived under his trough. Talking with Templeton was not the most interesting occupation in the world, but it was better than nothing. From 8 till 9, Wilbur planned to take a nap outside in the sun. From 9 till 11, he planned on digging a hole or a trench and possibly finding something good to eat that was buried in the dirt. From 11 to 12, he planned to stand still and watch flies, bees, and swallows in the air. 12 o'clock was going to be lunchtime. Middlings, warm water, apple parings, that's just apple peelings, meat gravy, carrot scrapings, meat scraps, and the wrapper of a package of cheese. Lunch would be over at 1. From 1 till 2, Wilbur planned to sleep. From 2 till 3, he planned to scratch his itchy places by rubbing against the fence. And from 3 to 4, he planned to stand perfectly still and think of what it was like to be alive. And he was going to wait for Fern. At 4, it would be supper time. Skim milk, bit of leftover sandwich from Lurvy's lunchbox, some prune skills, a morsel of this, a bit of that, some marmalade drippings, a little bit of this and a little more of that, perhaps some baked apple and a piece of leftover cake. Now, Wilbur had gone to sleep thinking about these plans, but he awoke at 6 and saw the rain, and it seemed as though he could not bear it. I get everything all beautifully planned out, and it has to go and rain, he says. For a while he stood gloomily indoors. Then he walked to the door and looked out. Drops of rain stuck to his face. His yard was now cold and wet. His trough had an inch of rainwater in it, and Templeton was nowhere to be seen. "Are you out there, Templeton?" called Wilbur. There was no answer, and suddenly Wilbur felt lonely and friendless. "One day just like another," he groaned. "I'm very young. I have no real friend here in the barn. It's going to rain all morning and all afternoon, and Fern won't come in such bad weather. Oh, honestly." And with that, Wilbur was crying for the second time in 2 days. Now, we're going to leave the story there, and I want you to imagine what Wilbur could possibly do later on in this chapter. I'll see you again another time.